Okay, here we go again. Okay, so there's a few files here that are going to be important, I think, to be familiar with, and that after you familiarize yourself with them, create them, also to back them up. These are the files, obviously, and actually happen to create like a directory tree and where you'll find them. So inside of the CSGO DS folder, assuming you followed my previous directions and used the exact same folder structure I did, there will be a CSGO folder. CSGO will have files in it, and so will the CFG subdirectory. Okay, back up at the top, again you can see the full directory paths. This is, these are the files we'll be working with. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so where are we right here? We're at our home directory, right? So let's go ahead and go into the Steam CMD and game server files, CSGO DS. Okay, are we where we want to be? Yes, we are. And if you remember correctly, the CSGO folder is located right here inside of the CSGO DS directory. So let's go back and take a look. CSGO DS, go down a little bit. Here's CSGO as a subdirectory. Down a little bit more. Here's the config file, or config directory is another subdirectory. Okay, so we are on the right location. Double check we're still there. Good. That's not the one we wanted then. Okay. There we are. Okay, now don't pay too much attention to me jumping back and forth between windows. I'm actually using a program called GNU Screen to do that. Quickly jumping back and forth. We can go over that some other time, but for now, just keep in mind I'm doing this only to show you, or to jump back and forth between the window with all the files we're going to be talking about and the window that I'm working in. Okay, so now we're in CSGO DS. Let's move into the CSGO folder because that's where the first set of files we're going to be talking about are. Okay. By default, this gamemodes.txt file is not there. So let's pretend it's not there. Let's remove it. Here we are. This is what you're going to have when you start up. When you go into this folder for the first time, you'll have a gamemodes.txt and a gamemodes.server.txt.example. Gamemodes server and gamemodes.txt are both called when the program is launched. If there is a gamemodes.server.txt present, it supersedes gamemodes.txt. They created that so you are not tempted to mess up gamemodes.txt. I am not a big fan of, renaming the gamemodeserver.txt.example into just gamemodeserver.txt because the contents are not quite what I'm looking for. So what I do is I copy gamemodes.txt to gamemodeserver.txt. And now we have a gamemodeserver.txt. This is something we can mess with, we can modify to our heart's content, and at the same time will come fully featured as the base server setup. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now and see what we've got. So let's go ahead and now I'll open up the editor. No, we'll just look at it. Less game modes server.txt. Okay. You can actually remove this. Just do not modify this file. Because we're actually in gamemodeserver.txt, this can obviously be changed. And you can actually rename this as well to accurately reflect where you're working. So just for the sake of consistency, we'll do that real quick. Okay, so now we know where we are and we know this is okay to modify. What I want you to pay attention to is this right here. If you remember, when we were in when we created our easy run, we had game type 0, game mode 1. That was included as part of our basic set of commands to launch a server. Okay, now if you'll see, game type classic is 0, and then inside of classic you'll see there's a set of game modes. Casual is 0. They keep going down. You'll see competitive is 1. So game type 0, game mode 1 is classic competitive. So when you tell srcds run to execute game type 0, game mode 1, it's going to come down here to competitive and start loading up all these values. What you need to pay attention to is this right here. Okay, you'll see right here it says, okay, two of the things it's going to do is it's going to execute a game mode competitive.cfg file and game mode competitive server.cfg file if it is present. By default, it is actually not present. So we will create it just like we created the game mode server. We'll copy and paste and then modify. But just keep in mind, that's how this is all working. Inside of this game mode server, when you launch and you tell it you want game type 0, game mode 0, then you would get classic casual. Or if you start heading further down the list, you could find yourself into gun game. That's game type 0, game mode 1, or I mean 0, so game type 1, game mode 0 will give you gun game progressive, which in turn would actually execute game modes arm race and game mode arm race server.cfg. You can modify all these things. They are, there for you to screw around with as you please. But for now, I just want you to recognize how it's working. Okay, so that is all you really need to know for now. We've created the game mode server.txt, which we can modify if we want to, and it's there, and because it's present, it supersedes gamemodes.txt. The other thing that's in this directory, if you remember, here's this directory. We talked about the game mode server, is also the message of the day. Right down here, message of the day.txt. So if we do nano message of the day.txt, this is it. You can type anything in there you want, or you can put a web page, whatever you'd like to do. For me, inside of my message of the day, I put a link to my web page. So when my server launches, this is what people see. They see this as the splashed up, or the splash screen of the message of the day. All right. So that's really simple, straightforward. You don't have to mess with it. By default, it will give you some nice little Counter-Strike picture. It'll look just fine. But that's there if you do choose to mess with it. So the next thing we need to do is we've looked at everything of importance, or basic importance, in this directory. So let's go down to the next subdirectory of importance, the config directory. Again, if you look, CSGODS, inside of there, CSGO, and inside of there, CSGO config. So that's where we're headed. So let's change directory into CFG. Let's look at the contents. So I'm going to go ahead and remove a couple things that aren't here by default. Okay. And okay, so this is what things are going to look like for you by default. There, oh, I've got to remove this one too. There is not going to be any autoexec.config, game mode competitive server, band IP, band user, or server.cfg. All those things are gone. They don't come by default. Those are all things that you're going to want to make yourself, and they are important. So let's go ahead and start with first thing being first. Again, if you remember inside of gamemodes.txt and gamemodes.server.txt, you remember that in the game modes, if you typed game type 0, game mode 1, the gamemodes.txt would tell the server to execute game mode competitive.cfg, and if it was present, game mode competitive server.cfg. In this case, you see game mode competitive.cfg by default. You don't see game mode competitive server. So again, like we did previously, we're going to copy it. Alright, there we go. Now we do have a game mode competitive server.cfg. This is the one we should modify. Again, you can modify this one, but it's just good practice not to modify it, as this by default will supersede this file when it's present as your configuration file. Now let's go ahead and go into it and see what's there available to us to modify. Okay, so there's actually a lot of things you can see here that people could modify. You know, go down to the bottom, you could talk, you know, could set all talk. Where's that? Here's all talk. Allow votes. You can turn this on or off. Go up here, bot quota mode. These are all things you can modify. So for this, since this is a competitive server we're dealing with here, let's go ahead and let's turn off bots. Nobody really wants to play with bots on a competitive server. So we did here, instead of saying, okay, you can have up to 10 bots and fill the slots by default, we're going to say you can have 0 bots and we're not going to fill them. You'll just operate as normal. If you wanted to change something, you could change the amount, other things here, change the amount of time to buy weapons, where you can buy the weapons, if there's free armor, if there's friendly fire, all these things. Friendly fire is enabled here by default. So these are all modifiable for you. But in order to keep things as realistic or similar to the default competitive mode as possible, all I changed was turning off the bots. You could do whatever you would like though. Alright, so good. That was, we've done that. We have set up the game mode competitive server.cfg. Now what else is there? There's quite a few other files. So we talked about message of the day, game mode server, game mode competitive server. We still have an autoexec.config, these band files, and the server.config. Let's go over to server.config. Again, not present. So let's touch server.cfg, nano server.cfg. Let's edit it. Now what do we want to do with our server.config? So server.config, technically you can add all kinds of things here, but I like to keep it down to the basics. Whenever the server is launched, this will be executed. So every time the server is launched, I want it to do a number of things. I want it to execute the band user.cfg. I want it to execute band ip.cfg. Again, those files do not exist, but they will. And then when it exits, I want to make sure it writes ID and writes IP. This correlates with this, and this correlates with this, meaning that it's going to load up all the band users and band IP addresses, and when you leave, it's going to write them, so they're not lost. What else might you want to do with your server.cfg? Well, you might want to give your server a name. So host name, let's call it CSGO CSGODedicated.com tutorial server 128 tick. We didn't set that yet. We'll just competitive. Let's keep it simple. Good. So now we have a name. This is what people are going to see when they see you in the server browser. How will they search? Let's see. How will they search for you though? Let's do SV tags. This is what the terms they can use to search for you. So CSGO dedicated competitive. There you go. Those are some CSGODedicated.com. Those are some search terms available. When people go into the server browser, if they type in any one of those things, it will filter down, and you know, our host name will be included in the name of, or in the number of filtered results. Other things you might want to do, you might want to have a password or not. So by default, I'll say there is no password. So just putting two quotations means no password. Maybe I want to say that every map will have a warm-up time of 60 seconds. Okay, good. So there's some basic stuff. Let's go ahead and save that. Now we have a very basic server.cfg. Now if you remember, when we first created this script, the easy run script, we did not have exec server.cfg on the end. This was just added. So you will modify your easy run script to add plus exec server.cfg. And that means that when you launch it, it's going to go looking for this file and execute all the commands in there. So if you see, you're kind of like nesting execs within execs. So one file calls another, which executes as another, and executes, you know, all these other different additional files being executed as they get called. It's a little complicated. That's why I would just, you know, say don't take advantage of this whole exec feature, or don't take for granted the exec feature, and just kind of keep things as simple as possible. But just recognize that's how it's happening. Okay, good. So now what do we have left to do? So we've done the autoexec, or we did the server.cfg, the game mode competitive, we've done these. Okay, what about autoexec.cfg? This is something that will load every time you launch any server. So this one was called specifically by a server, or by a launch instance. So when we launched, if we were to call easy launch right there, then you would get these options: game, CSGO, console, user con. You know, you would get all these things made available to you, and it would launch exec server.cfg. If I remove this plus exec server.cfg, that file does not run. But autoexec runs every single time. So think about the things you want to run every single time, and that's what you're going to do with autoexec. And it's not there by default, so let's make it. Okay, autoexec.cfg. Let's modify. So I could have set this inside of a map, inside of the game modes competitive. As you saw, remember, see our game modes competitive server, there was an SV allow vote. But I want to make sure it happens for every server all the time. I always want that to be there. I always want to make sure that I'm logging the files. I always want to make sure that developer mode is on. Now, these last two, to be honest, I don't remember exactly why I had to include those. But I know I had problems when they weren't there. I don't know if it was fixed during an update, but for example, this one, the SVLAN 0, I believe before I had that in there, I was having difficulty finding myself on the server browser. Once I included that, I wasn't having that trouble anymore. Okay. Alright, so these are some basic files. I'd recommend putting pretty much all of them in your autoexec.cfg, because people always want to be able to vote where they're going. It's good to have the logs. You may need them, you know, if you want to justify bans or go back and collect stats or whatever. Developer mode you're going to need if you want to do any customizations. Okay, so that's like a basic autoexec.cfg. So what else do we have left? So we've done autoexec, game mode competitive, server.cfg. We didn't create these, and to be honest, actually we don't have to, since we have specified inside of server.cfg that you're going to want to run. We're going to want these files. The server will check to see if they exist. When it finds out that they don't exist, it will create them. So with that in mind, we've actually done everything we need to do to really kind of a basic server going. You're now familiar with all the kind of essential files that you need to modify. So now let's go ahead and launch it. Alright, looks like everything's working well. Check the status. The host name is set as anticipated. 0 bots, 10 out of 0. And if you go ahead and look above, you'll see that when it could not find the banned user and banned IP, it went ahead and made them. So let's go back and check to make sure they're there. And here they are. Everything's there. It's all set. And that takes care of setting up the basic server configuration.